Well, we've reached the last of our quick and dirty chapters. Chapter 15, Global Media. 1956, the height of the Cold War rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. In this atmosphere, a group of business leaders, academics, and others devised four theories of media around the world. The first theory is the Authoritarian Theory. Certainly there are authoritarian countries around the world in the mid-1950s, and there continue to be authoritarian countries today. The key to the role of the media in a truly authoritarian system is that the leadership is believed to have a pipeline to truth, oftentimes from God. So that makes the role of the media simple, although not empowering. It's the role of the media to be the servant of the government, to take the word from on high and to present it to the people. In an authoritarian system, the news media is highly controlled through regulation, intimidation, and, if need be, force. The communist theory of media, some students will say, how is it different than the authoritarian theory? Well, I think there are some differences. Now, mind you, what communism is in 1956 was very much influenced by the version of communism that was practiced in the Soviet Union. Under this system, media are like the public relations department for the ruling party. So just as the public relations department of General Motors would not criticize top management, it would just be unthinkable. The same would be true with the media under a communist system. Just as General Motors would not want to have some sort of rogue people just talking for the company, maybe critically, maybe not. Well, you could say the same thing for the media under a communist system, that the media is to speak with one voice, the official voice of the party. Independent press under a communist system are undesirable and suppressed. Another similarity between public relations and the theory of media under the communist system is that just as the head of a public relations department reports directly to top management, media is also tied to the top management of government. And so, just as a public relations person sells a company's goals and tries to burnish a company's good image, you could say something similar about the media's purpose under a communist system. The libertarian theory of media is a philosophical construct. I can't think of any country around the world that actually operates under a truly libertarian system of media. But because it is considered to be so pure and, in the eyes of some, so ideal, it is included in this typology. Libertarians have a positive attitude about human nature. They see people as rational, truth-seeking beings. They believe in the marketplace of ideas. They believe that all sorts of ideas, ideas that are popular, ideas that are unpopular, ideas that are soothing and ideas that are troubling, that they should all be freely discussed in the marketplace of ideas with the belief that the most rational, most truthful ideas will eventually win out. That said, under a libertarian system, there continues to be room for people who have different opinions. and people are encouraged to have their own point of view. However, the libertarian theory does generally accept that there will be a few mainstream, rational, high-quality ideas that most people will adopt most of the time. In terms of a threat to this rational search for truth, the libertarians are generally more concerned with government regulation than they are with corporate overreach. The social responsibility theory is what is in play in the United States and Canada and Western Europe and Japan and South Korea and Australia and the other developed representative democracies around the world. Under the social responsibility theory, the media has, well, responsibilities. It has responsibility to provide information for those who govern us. High quality information as to what is going on with people out there in the countryside. Just imagine how important it is for a governor or a mayor to know what is going on in their state or their community. As for us, the media has a responsibility to give the citizens the information that they need to intelligently self-govern. Under the social responsibility theory, the media is to be a check against government overreach. In other words, whereas in other media systems, authoritarian or communist, the media is to present the government's line. Under the social responsibility theory, it is the duty of the media to push back. So, I'd like to see you get into the chat box and tell me, which of these functions is the U.S. news media fulfilling? And which of these functions are they falling short of? And of course, you can call out particular media outlets if you wish. In the years since 1956, many theorists have added a fifth media system, and that is the developmental theory of media. It is a much more contemporary theory, and it is what is followed in developing nations around the world. And I think the best way to describe the developmental theory is that it is a little bit authoritarian, but with a considerable dose of social responsibility as well. The authoritarian part of the developmental theory is that there's always a few issues that governments are very sensitive about, where the media is expected to toe the line. But on many, many issues, the media is approximately as free as it is in a social responsibility nation to cover the news as they see fit. So to summarize, under the developmental theory, the media can often report freely, but at the same time, there are definite limits. Certainly, the internet has changed everything, including media across the world. Because of the internet, more than ever before, media is crossing national borders. More than ever before, giant corporations have a media footprint in multiple countries. More than ever before, the differences in what level of press freedom should exist, the difference in standards between countries, they are more glaring than ever. Furthermore, the rights of individuals to express themselves is maybe under even greater pressure in the internet age. So, on to the chat box. What do you see happening as a consequence of us having not just our hometown news or even our home country news, but global news and entertainment at our fingertips? Alan Wells is a media theorist who has devised a model for looking at the media system of any country to try to sort of, well, size it up. First is looking at control. Who controls the media system? Is it more the government? Is it more private enterprise? Is it the advertisers? Is it the church? Finance is the second thing to look at. Where do media outlets get the money that pays the bills? If it all comes from viewers, readers, and listeners, well, that says one thing. But if it all comes from advertisers, well, that's going to make those media outlets very different. They're going to have very different priorities. Third, programming goals. What are media outlets trying to accomplish with their programming? Is it the home shopping network, where it is simply to make a profit by selling stuff? Is it the public broadcasting system, where there is an attempt to teach, to expose people to high culture? Is it a serious news organization like the New York Times, that its goal is to tell you what is important and to explain in great detail why it is important? Who's the target audience of the media that you are looking at? Certainly a message that is aimed at teenage boys is going to be very different, not just in content, but in tone, than a message that is targeted at elderly women. And then finally, feedback. Not just how much feedback gets back to the people who are creating media messages, but how do they hear back from their audiences? If it's cheering or booing, well, that says something, but not much. It just says like or dislike. There isn't real detail in it. But if there's a feedback mechanism where very specific complaints or ideas or what have you can get through, well, that says something different. We are now going to go on a media trip around the world, talking about the media systems in play in various nations. And so we will start with our closest neighbor, Canada. As with the US, the social responsibility system is in effect. But Canada's media system is not just a copy of the United States. As you might imagine, Canada is a little sensitive about being overshadowed by the gigantic and rather loud United States. And so Canadian broadcasters, in order to maintain their broadcast licenses, have to show that they are putting out a certain amount of distinctly Canadian content. Canada is also a place where runaway production Remember that term from the movie chapter. A place where runaway production is running away to. The Canadian government has seen to it that in many cases, production costs can be lower if shot in Canada than in the United States. Western Europe and Britain. One difference is that cable and satellite television are still growing in this region of the world, while in the US, cable and satellite subscriptions are slowly going down. Although the nations in this region are under the social responsibility system, they are more heavily regulated, typically, than in the United States. And that regulation oftentimes takes the form of a government requirement that stations provide quite a bit of public service content. One of the reasons why I don't get too terribly upset about cable news operations or magazines or what have you that take an obvious point of view is that there are clearly some very robust democracies, particularly in this part of the world, where it is routine for newspapers to take an obvious political point of view. Let's move on to Central and Latin America. Television programming is dominated by the US, Mexico, and Brazil. Telenovelas are a cultural export from this part of the world. While it certainly varies by country, over the last several decades, more governments in this region have grown more stable, and that has translated into news media that is freer than it was. So think about developmental moving toward social responsibility. This is a part of the world where newspaper circulation is continuing to grow, unlike in the US, where it is declining. Some countries in the region, Costa Rica is a notable example, has very high newspaper readership. The Middle East and Islamic countries. I thought Ralph Hanson's typology of the press in regard to the Middle Eastern and Islamic countries was very interesting. So his term, the mobilized press, is official government-owned press. Loyalist press is media that is loyal to the government. Maybe it is owned by members of the ruling oligarchy. And then the diverse press is that media which is truly free and independent. This is a part of the world where internet use is increasing. And I would say pretty much any place where internet use is increasing, people are being exposed to a greater diversity of ideas. Often, nations in this part of the world, small media can have a very large influence. In places where more formal news media are heavily regulated, alternative media like faxes or photocopies, home video, blogs, and social media can be very important in putting out alternative points of view. I'd like to say a little bit about Al Jazeera. It is one of the major broadcasters in the world. It is located in the small oil-rich nation of Qatar, and it seeks to present what is called a pan-Arab view of the world. I'm not sure about this line. I have a personal friend who is a Al Jazeera viewer, And he feels that Al Jazeera has been caught up in the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that Al Jazeera is a little bit caught in the middle. And so, as a result of that, Al Jazeera has also become rather controversial in the Arab world. But whatever it is, it's really big. With an audience of 40 million viewers, it dwarfs any of the US broadcast networks. So, what I mean by it presenting a pan-Arab point of view is it seeks to not just be the view of one country. Africa. Well, there are a number of different systems in play throughout Africa. There are a variety of press controls in the countries on the continent. Newspapers are generally not a big factor. They are a vestige of European colonialism. Those newspapers that do exist are oftentimes published in the colonial languages, most often English and French. Radio is a very important medium on the African continent. When you think that literacy may not be 100%, electricity in the home may not be a given, then radio, sometimes hand cranked, radio is important. Television has not yet established itself as a major medium on much of the continent, although, of course, that varies by country, and it also varies between the countryside and the cities. On to Russia and those republics that were once part of the USSR. I'm not sure that Russia and the Soviet Union had a tradition of free press similar to what we have in the United States and Western Europe. I mean, no doubt there's a great tradition of Russian literature, but of a free and open news media in the way that we understand it, well, not really. Now, that said, things have changed somewhat since the fall of the Soviet Union. Most media is now privately owned. Think about that in light of the communist system that was in place before. So most media is privately owned. However, high levels of self-censorship remain. In other words, even people in media can't quite believe that they are free to report. Furthermore, there continue to be people in government who simply assume that it is the natural order of things, that media should simply be a propaganda tool for the government. If broadcasters are more regulated in Western Europe than they are in the United States, then it is fair to say that television is more regulated in Russia and the former Soviet republics than it is in Western Europe. On to India. India has the second largest newspaper readership in the world. Note, this is a country that is on the move. We hear about how much China is progressing, but much the same can be said for India. 90% of households have radio, but the more interesting statistic perhaps is that 3 out of 5 households now have television. So television is going through a period of growth, and broadcasters are enjoying greater freedom. India's sizable middle class means that mobile media is in play. in India, and in a big way. In a big way. China. The media environment is changing rapidly in this vast, quite varied nation. China is the world's largest newspaper market, not surprisingly. One outpost of freedom in China is talk radio. And wouldn't it be fascinating to know what they talk about on Chinese talk radio? As you could probably say about the United States, in some regions there's a greater diversity of ideas and information and media, and in other places it's a little less diverse. Well, you can say the same for China. On to Japan. Certainly when we think about Japan, we think about a maker of media technology, of media consumer products. Broadcasting in Japan is roughly based upon the British model. So a considerable amount of commercial programming, but also a significant amount of public service programming. If telenovelas are a great cultural export of some of the Latin American countries, then manga comic books are a huge cultural export of Japan. So we come to the last slide in the course. The gentleman pictured here is Marshall McLuhan, the famed Canadian media theorist. McLuhan's most famous book was probably his 1962 book, The Gutenberg Galaxy. And in that book, McLuhan theorized that television would eventually weave the world together into a great global village. He was fascinated by how electronic media created global interaction among people. And I've got to say, McLuhan's global village, woven together by television, I'm not sure it ever really quite happened that way. Or maybe it only happened that way once, perhaps on July 20th, 1969, the moon landing. But then again, maybe McLuhan was right. Maybe his terminology was just a little wrong. Maybe it wasn't television that was weaving the world together into a great global village. Maybe it was the internet. So, get on the chat box as you begin to exit this chapter, and let's start a discussion. Does the internet make us more or less a global village? This concludes Chapter 15.